we're very, very fortunate this morning to have someone with us from the mother country. Susan Blackmore is a psychologist, a freelance writer, extensively, a lecturer and broadcaster, has a degree in psychology and physiology, and she used to do research in parapsychology, but for some reason, and I suspect she'll give us a hint as to why, she doesn't research in parapsychology anymore. She writes for several magazines and newspapers, including the Guardian, Psychology Today, a frequent contributor by way of radio and television. She's the author of over 60 academic articles and about 80 book contributions. And of course, she's done many book reviews. Some of the books that she has written include Dying to Live on Near-Death Experiences and Conversations on Consciousness. Excuse me, Don.
Some of them are for sale out there.
I'm sorry?
Some of the books are for sale out there.
Another book, Consciousness, an Introduction, and she's had her works translated into over 20 other languages. I'm confident if you listen closely this morning, you will come to enjoy the fact that we're all a bunch of copycats or mimickers. I'm sure you've heard the term meme coming from the Greek to imitate, but we will get deeper insights into that very important topic this morning. I think you will come to a greater appreciation as to whether or not you came here freely this morning or not. I will be happy to turn it over to the authority in this area. Susan, you don't have to run away. It is my privilege to welcome and have you mimic me as you welcome Susan Blackmore.
I've got a microphone. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here. There was some dispute over email about what I should talk about, and I hope you will all be happy with the decision that I would talk about free will, not parapsychology or memes or consciousness, but you're very welcome to ask me about any of those things later on if you like. Who thinks they have free will? Hands up if you think you have free will. Okay, that's about half of you. Hands up if you think you don't have free will. Ooh. Hands up and put their hands up both times. Oh. And hands up who didn't put their hands up at all. I despair. Arizonians or whatever you call yourself. Hopeless. Well, this is said to be the most discussed. Is this sound all right, or is it a bit loud? It's good? Okay, it just sounds a bit distorted to me. Said to be the most discussed topic of all time, but of course I'm going to solve the whole thing today and nobody will need to discuss it anymore. One of the difficulties of thinking about free will is it really entails oneself. Because, let's just do something, okay? Get a feeling of this. All right, I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, go. And when I say go, I want you to do anything you like of your own free will. You mustn't hurt the person next to you, or do anything illegal. Otherwise, anything you like, okay? Ready? 1, 2, 3, go. I like the hat. That's the best. Excellent. Right. Who did that? You felt probably as though you did it. I mean, some of you didn't, of course, we'll come back to it. But this is what we're talking about. This sense that I decided to throw my hat, make a whoop, drink my drink, whatever it was you decided to do. So we can't think about free will without thinking about who am I. And, oh, there's a horrible humming noise. I think it would be nice to turn it. I've got a very loud voice, so if you turn it down, then I can talk louder, which is more natural to me. Is there anyone here who's in charge of these things? Is one of these mics?
Cut the wire.
Yeah. Is one of the other microphones interfering? Is this one on? Because if that's on, that would cause the problem. Oh yeah. Can't.
Microphones have free will. Okay.
Well, that's better. It stopped humming. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Well, carry on. I hope while all that was happening, you were thinking about the nature of self. I've spent a lot of time thinking about the nature of self. I'm meditated every day for more than 25 years, and quite a lot of that entails wondering, who is meditating? I can't find myself. Anyone here who's a meditator? Good. Well, then you've probably had the same experience. Whether or not you've used that as a Zen koan and actually asked yourself who's meditating, or whether you simply sat there and kind of thought, what's happening? Who is this? You don't find the self when you look for it in experience. At least that's what many people say. I'll just run over there, press the button and run away again and we'll be okay, yeah? I'm going to suggest that both the self and free will are illusory. But I want to be very clear what I mean by that, because some people would interpret that and when it comes to consciousness, exactly the same thing happens. You say consciousness is an illusion, and then they say, Sue Blackmore thinks consciousness doesn't exist. I don't mean something that doesn't exist.
Yes.
Okay.
Just that often use this.
Apparently,
Yeah, just
it
that
sounds like
often use
the
this.
lavalier died.
Make interference between
hello. Okay, that works better. Does it go horrible when I go near this one? No, it doesn't. Okay, happy with this one. Right, so I want to be clear what I mean by an illusion. I'm just using the ordinary dictionary definition of an illusion, which is something that is not what it seems to be. If you look at this simple illusion, what can you see? Pardon? They're moving, right. Now, you know they're not moving, but you see them moving. This is a very simple kind of illusion because it's a appearance-reality confusion. You know full well that they're not moving, and yet you can't stop the experience of them moving. The kind of illusions I'm talking about, of self, consciousness, free will, are a bit more subtle than that. But the point I'm trying to make is, there is a problem here. There is this feeling of free will. There is this feeling of being a self. But maybe we're wrong about the nature of those things. And that's what I want to explore today. So the dictionary definition is simply a false impression or notion. Something that deceives or misleads. Something that's not what it seems to be. So, if you are not what you seem to be, I think we need to start with what you do seem to be. So I would like you all, please, just to sit quietly and be yourself.
Okay, please get that mic a little close now.
Can you please sit there and be yourself? Okay. You're conscious? Yeah? You got the feeling of what I'm talking about? Now, how does it seem? Does it seem a bit like this? No? Yes? No? I can see lots of people nodding and going, now, obviously, I know that you don't think there's a sofa inside your head with a homunculus sitting on it. But I submit that for many people, and I'd like to hear later from people who don't feel this way, the natural way to feel is that I am inside my head, looking out through the eyes at the world, and that I'm in charge. I can pull the levers and make the arms and legs do what they want to do. Yeah? Well, that sensation is what Dan Dennett calls the Cartesian theatre. Has anyone read Dan Dennett's work? Consciousness Explained and so on. Excellent, good. Then you know what I'm talking about. What he said in this famous book, it's more than 20 years old now, but he said nearly all the scientists and philosophers and the psychologists studying consciousness, free will and so on reject Cartesian dualism. They're absolutely sure that it doesn't work to say mind and body are two separate things. So they say, oh, I'm not a dualist. But then they still believe that somehow there's a sort of screen inside the mind. I shut my eyes and I can imagine a pink elephant. And, there is a pink elephant in some sense in my head. And that I am looking at a stream of experiences going past. And that I am able to control those things. They still feel that. And many scientists still talk about things coming into consciousness, which would be a kind of magical thing, coming into the Cartesian theatre. So that's what's left over from when you reject Cartesian dualism, but you don't quite go far enough. He says, when you discard Cartesian dualism, you really must discard the show that would have gone on in the Cartesian theatre, and the audience as well, because neither the show nor the audience can be found in the brain, and the brain is the only real place there is to look for them. So we look at the brain, and what do we find? Well, we find all sorts of things. There's nothing particular about this drawing of the brain, but we find, here's the motor cortex, which coordinates the actions we make. There's much more complicated stuff in here, decision-making, self-control and so on here, language areas, auditory cortex. Here at the back of the brain is massive, about a third of the brain is devoted to vision. When we open our eyes and the world appears, it takes a third of an enormous brain to do that incredible job. And then we have all sorts of control mechanisms going on, and memories and so on that interact with the frontal cortex, where a lot of the decision-making and action control goes on. Where am I in all of this? There isn't a bit labelled me. More importantly, really, there isn't a middle. People do talk about bottom-down processes, top-down processes, but there isn't really a top. There isn't anywhere for a self to be a sort of unitary self of the kind that we might imagine. There's just a massive parallel processing system. And when I say massive parallel processing, just to give you an example, in the visual system, there are thought to be roughly 40 or 45 separate parallel pathways of processing going on, and they don't come together and make the picture that you see in front of your eyes. They're all doing different jobs all at once. Seeing, this is another whole area and another whole lecture that I love in enjoying these thoughts of, that vision is all these things happening at once, and yet we kind of get this impression that I'm seeing a picture and there must be a picture inside my head. There ain't no picture inside the head, and there are lots of ways of demonstrating that. Interestingly, I've just been at, the reason I'm here, some of you may know, I've just been at the Toward a Science of Consciousness conference, which happens in Tucson every 2 years. And mind-blowing discoveries in neuroscience shown there. And it seems to me that the more we learn about the brain, the worse the problems of self-consciousness and free will become. We're chasing them away. You could say it's a bit like the God of the gaps. Everyone used to be quite happy to think that God made us and God made the world and God did this and God did that. And as science has progressed, well, obviously he doesn't do that and he doesn't do that. But, if you believe in evolution, perhaps he just started the universe off. He's got kind of pushed back that way. Well, something similar is happening to the self and free will in the brain. The more we learn about it, the less there is for the self with its free will to do. Does that mean people give up on those ideas? How many people still believe in God in your amazingly religious country? Even in Britain, where it's less than half the population, it's still an awful lot of people. And when it comes to our brain, chasing out the self and free will, which is what the science seems to be doing, is quite difficult. So I would suggest that perhaps these are common assumptions that we make based on our intuitions. That somehow I am unified. I'm me. There's only one me. It's me. And that me is continuing. It was me. Okay, my body's changed a lot since I was 5 years old, or 20 years old, or 50 years old. But the me, it's still me. And this me has two really important properties. Firstly, I am the experiencer of my life, and I'm the one who sees that lovely turquoise blouse over there, or feels the feet on the ground. I'm the experiencer. And secondly, I'm the doer. I'm the one who, just did that. That was me. I did that. Would you agree this is how it seems? Yeah, general nodding and good. Right. One of my heroes. Dan Dennett is often called the devil. In fact, there is a peer-reviewed journal article by Burton Voorhees who was at this conference this week, and he actually wrote in a peer-reviewed journal, Dan Dennett is the devil. Does he look like the devil? He looks like he's really cuddly, isn't he? Ah, it's lovely. But the reason people find him so unsettling and upsetting is because he's basically saying you have to give up your intuitions. All these intuitions we have about self and consciousness and free will are really misleading. The more we learn about the brain and how it functions, and the world in general and how it functions, the less good our intuitions serve us. So let's start. I want to do a bit about self and then a bit about free will. How long would you like me to talk for? Who's in charge here? What?
Go for an hour if you want. We'll have Q&A afterwards.
And what time do we have to stop?
As long as you
Before
wish.
noon.
You get tired of talking.
Okay, I would suggest, actually there's a clock up there so I ought to know. I know, Adam, will you tell me when it's like 25 past or half past, and just wave at me like anything, and then I'll just bring it sort of, because I'd like to have a nice long time for the Q&A. Right, so this is a rather crude way of thinking about self, but it's very helpful. I think this comes from Derek Parfit, the philosopher, to divide theories of self into two main types: ego theory and bundle theory. Ego theory is not just that you have a soul or a spirit or a ghost in the machine or something of that kind, but any theory that implies that there is a continuing self that has all those four qualities that I just listed. If you believe, excuse me, if you believe that in some sense, whether it's a soul or whether it's a brain process, you are a continuing entity that is conscious, has experiences, and makes decisions and causes actions, then you are an ego theorist. The alternative is to say that there really is no persisting self at all. Selves might persist for a moment or two, or even a few minutes possibly, but they're essentially ephemeral constructions. They're just kind of bundles or illusions, if you like, but bundles of thoughts, memories, and so on. Or bundles of thoughts and experiences, but they're tied together by memories. But there isn't really any kind of persisting self at all. So, and I want everybody to put their hand up once, all right? You're not allowed to put your hand, who, at the moment, I mean, I'll explain more, but from this limited explanation so far, who is an ego theorist? Right. And who is a bundle theorist? And who didn't put their hand up? Right. I would love to know why, and I'm sure you could give me good reasons, but we haven't time to do that, but we'll persist with this. The idea of bundle theory comes from David Hume, and this is his very famous statement. Do you remember the picture at the beginning of me meditating by the river where we live in Devon? I think he was having a similar experience, as indeed many philosophers have. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble upon some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but a perception. That's the foundation of bundle theory, although it comes in many other forms, as we will see. Those of you who put your hand up as being ego theorists, do you find this slightly disturbing?
No.
No? Well, then you're probably a bundle theorist. No? Does anybody find it disturbing? Yes. I don't really understand how one can not find it disturbing. It seems so natural to think that I'm more than the experiences. Look now at this stage and that screen and me here. Bundle theory is saying that's all there is. There isn't a you observing me up here. There isn't a you having the experience of sitting in this room. There's just the experience of sitting in this room. There's just the vision of what you can see. But there isn't anybody looking. That's surely disturbing, isn't it? But, okay, if it's not, that's fine. Then you have managed in some way to deal with it. I'm really talking not to the people who've dealt with it, but the people who are thinking about it possibly for the first time or possibly in a new way. Because if you just brush over it, you're not seeing the depth of the difficulty here. This is about the deepest questions there are. Who am I? What's going on in the world? What's it all about? Why? I mean, that's what it's about. And if you don't find it disturbing, that's either because you're not really thinking about it clearly, or because you're enlightened and have overcome these illusions. So, of course, people responded back to Hume with, "That's ridiculous, you stupid idiot," you know. They, not in quite so rude words, but Thomas Reid said, "But I am not thought, I am not action, I am not feeling, I am something which thinks and acts and feels." That's the way something in most of us responds. I'm not just the vision, I'm the one who's seeing things. So this is kind of the heart of the argument. And we see it played out endlessly in the difference between different religions. If you take the major popular religions of the world today, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they are all fundamentally based on the idea of some kind of ego theory. They might have a slightly different idea. Even Hinduism, in most of its manifestations, has something like a soul. But in Christianity and Islam, this soul is what it's all about. God gave you the soul when you were born, and it doesn't matter that we can't decide when it came into you or any of those difficulties, but it did. It's mysterious. And have faith. So we have this soul, and this is the soul that continues through our life, that makes me, me. This is a very firm kind of ego theory. On the other hand, the other extreme of religions is Buddhism. Now, there are very many forms of Buddhism, and in Tibetan Buddhism, and some other versions as well, you get the idea of personal reincarnation, which brings back the very thing that the Buddha said doesn't exist, which is bizarre because so many people these days associate Buddhism with the idea of reincarnation, but it's not there in a whole lot of other branches of Buddhism. It's not there in Zen, which is my own tradition, at least not in the form of a ego that is reborn into other lives. The Buddha was very clear. I think the absolute heart of Buddhist insights comes in the things he says about self. This bundle of elements, this thing here, this bundle of elements is void of self. In it there is no sentient being. Just as a set of wooden parts receives the name of carriage, so do we give to elements the name of fancied being. Well, that's easy with our car, isn't it? I mean, I can say that's my car. I'm very fond of my car. It's got hard, bashed the whole front in, but never mind. And it's full of mud and dirt because we live in the country, and there's always plants in the back and bits of cardboard lying around. And it's my car. And once the bit got ripped off, the wing mirror got ripped off, and you put a new one on. And it doesn't matter. I know it's only a car, but it's got a sort of quality about it. But I'm quite happy to think that there isn't really something called my car. It's just elements. But when we come to our own bodies, it's rather different. And when we think about, having an amputation or having a heart transplant or something, it's threatening in a way that the wing mirror isn't. But the Buddha says, basically, we're like a carriage. We give ourselves names, but we should remember when we do that, it's just a name. There isn't any self in there. There isn't any sentient being in there. The experiencer, the one who's sentient. So when you're looking at me now, the Buddha would say, there are just visions. There's not you having them. Now, you've told me whether you're an ego theorist or a bundle theorist, but I want to push you a little bit further with a very, very famous philosophical exercise. Some of you may know this. It's the Teletransporter. So I want you to imagine, I think I need a Teletransporter. Can I have a chair? I'll get this to be good. We need a concrete thing. Okay, here's the Teletransporter. That's one end. And here's the other. Now, let us say that this is Tucson over here. And over here is, who'd like to go somewhere really nice? Pardon, where?
Scott.
Scott?
Bring me Scotty.
Oh, yes, yes. Where would you like to go if you're beamed?
Kabul.
Kabul, okay? Whoa. You better be able to get back quickly if you go to Kabul. I've been there. It's... Well, anyway. Okay. This can be Arizona, and that can be Kabul over there. All right? And let's say you really, really want to go to Kabul, okay? Now, what happens with a teletransporter is you get in, there's a button.
Seatbelt.
I'm ready to go. Okay, now, when I press the button, this clever machine completely disintegrates my body by taking every bit of information in the body. Every single 100% bit of information, okay? And it beams it, through the internet or something, to the other thing in Kabul, right? It's making a complete replica of every single neuron, every synapse, every bit of chemistry going on in the brain, everything is exactly the same in Kabul, okay? Now, I want to make it clear this is a thought experiment. I'm not saying it exists. And with a thought experiment, you have to take the rules and believe them, okay? So I don't want anyone thinking, oh, it might not be safe. It's a thought experiment. It's 100% safe. Nothing is going to go wrong. It's going to disintegrate you completely and reconstruct something absolutely identical over there. Here's the button. Shall I press it? Okay, think about it. Would you go?
No.
Okay, hands up who would go. Hands up who wouldn't go. You should be the same people as the ego and bundle theorists, but there are probably some of you who actually are not the same. I would like to hear from a couple of people who said they wouldn't go as to why. Who'd like to tell me why you wouldn't go? Yeah.
First of all, not all the information is...
Yeah, no, sorry, you've completely... No, this is a thought experiment, 100%.
I'm talking about the thought also.
Okay.
So you are material and thought.
Okay, so you think there's something extra that wouldn't go, and that's called thought.
Yes. So
Okay,
it's
good.
going to be, even if it's 0.000 something, it's still not me.
Okay, so this lady here thinks there's something in addition to all this stuff, and it's something to do with me, and it's thought. Okay, anybody else? Yes?
It's like dividing by zero. You don't know what you're really going to get out of it.
In what way is it like dividing by zero?
Well, you write equations so that you prove 7 equals 6. But when you look at it in detail on that side, it's always simpler than dividing by
I think that's an objection of it not being... I think you're not following the rules of the thought experiment. The rules of the thought experiment are it's absolutely identical. I mean, this may prove to be impossible once we understand the physics properly, but that's not the point. The point is it would be absolutely identical. But there's a gap, and the information has been streamed somewhere. Yes?
I think I would no longer exist.
Right, you would have been destroyed and somebody else...
It would exist, yeah.
Okay, it wouldn't really be you. Okay. Anyone else like to say anything? Yes?
Because the whole is more than the sum of the parts.
Okay, but so there is something more. There's something more. Okay, so all of you are making objections that are basically some kind of ego theory. That rather than being simply and only a machine that constructs perceptions, memories, thoughts, etc., there's something more. Yes? That means you are ego theorists.
No, not really, because you're talking about experiences.
Yeah.
So experiences also matter. So that the person who's at this chair not necessarily has the same experiences as the person.
Yes. Okay. So you are
So I'm
not
not talking about soul.
not talking about.
Soul.
No, you're not. No, I know that. You're not talking about soul.
Yes.
It's a much more modern version of an ego theory. But perhaps I could drop that and say, at least you believe there is something more to being human, to being yourself, than just the information in the structure of your brain and body. Yeah?
The experiences.
Yeah, okay, fine. So the point of this, really, is not to get a right answer about anything. It's to use it to help you think about your views, which it clearly has done, because all of you are coming up with interesting thoughts about what might happen when you go. For a straightforward materialist, or indeed a monist of any kind, I think, because I wouldn't say I'm a materialist, but I'm a monist, there's no problem about going. I would say, this is what I was lecturing about yesterday at the Consciousness Conference, that the self, in as much as it exists, is a very short-lived temporary construction that only pops up in a brain when it's needed. So when I go, oh, am I conscious now? Oh, here I am. Then there seems to be a me and a world. Most of the time when I'm walking around in the world, it's not like that. The brain isn't even bothering to construct a self. There isn't any self in there. There's just multiple parallel streams of information being processed. And at any time a self can pop up, and it always thinks, oh, it's the same me as before. It's wrong about that, but anyway. So that's my own view, and it could be completely wrong, but, you know, and you lot of you wouldn't go, maybe right. It's an interesting question. So, is it extra fast travel, or is it death?
Well, the first or second time.
The first or second time?
The first time, I would have gone in kicking and screaming. But the second time would have the memory of having been gone in.
And be all right.
Reluctant. But, oh, that wasn't so bad.
Did you hear that?
But it's
That's
still-
brilliant. What the man in the front here said was, the first or second time, because the first time he would go in kicking and screaming. But because of his intellectual beliefs about it, he's implying that actually it'd be fine. He'd wake up over in cardboard and go, oh,
Now,
how
the
interesting. I
second
think what I
time
am.
would be, here I am. That
Yeah.
wasn't so bad.
Here I am.
I'm still
It
here.
wasn't so bad. I'm still here. And so the second time, he'd go in quite happily. Very interesting response. Thank you for that. So, let us come back to the topic that I'm supposed to be talking about. I hope you can see why all this is relevant. Because when it comes to free will, that you cannot make sense of the notion of free will without it being my free will. And I hope by now I've made you a little bit uncomfortable about who you are. If I haven't, then I've failed in my intention for this morning. So we have here, as we did with bundle theory, a kind of classic opposition, which we still have today, but I'm giving you some hundreds of years old examples. Samuel Johnson said, all theory is against the freedom of the will, all experience for it. And Boswell, who wrote the life of Johnson, says, sir, we know our will is free and there's an end on it. Well, of course, Johnson knew that. That's why he said, all experience is for it. Even then, Adam, when was Samuel Johnson writing?
Well, 17...
Anyway, 18th century, mid-18th century. They didn't have any neuroscience then. They didn't know what the brain was doing. But even so, he could tell from looking at the way the world works that there isn't room for free will. And he got into the position that many, many of my students have got into over the years. When they've said to me, and they've come to me, I'm really pleased when they come to me going, I don't understand. Because intellectually, I'm a bundle theorist. But in my heart, I'm an ego theorist. Intellectually, I think there can't be free will. But actually, I feel there must be. Help, help. I said, can't help you. Suffer, suffer. So we get the same thing in the religions. Oh, I meant to have a different picture there. I meant to have a different religion. Sorry about that. I have a lovely picture of an Islamic thing, but the principle is there. God gave you a soul, at least partly, because the soul has free will. And what is the point of religion, or at least of the Abrahamic religions, the monotheistic religions, if you don't have free will? You cannot be judged as whether you're going to heaven or hell if you don't have the free will to choose between good and evil. It's absolutely fundamental in religion. And again, think how many people in this country are religious and they do believe this. They do believe that they have the free will to choose between good and evil. And they will, on that account, after they die, of course they don't die because they carry on, and they either carry on in horrendous, eternal pain, misery, damnation, fear and horror, or, is God ringing? It's probably my phone. It's telling me to stop being so wicked. Or they go to heaven because they've made the right choices of their own free will all of their life. Or if they made a bit of a mistake, they went to confession and said, I'm really, really, really sorry, I won't do it again. I want to get to heaven, please, and I'll be very good from now on. It's critical to those religions that happens. Of course, in another bit of my life, I would talk about these religions as being very, very well-evolved memplexes. It is because of those threats and promises, because of those claims for free will and the soul, that those religions have outcompeted all the other religions over the last 2,000 to 2,500 years. Outcompeted Buddhism, at least in the West, by a large way, because it is somehow so much more intuitively pleasing to believe that we are somebody in here, and we do have free will, and we do choose between good and evil. And the religions piggyback on that and create all the misery and suffering they do because of this psychological tricks they play. That's another whole story, but it's closely related to the whole free will question. So again, we look at the other extreme, which Buddhism represents, I would say. And this is my all-time favourite quotation from the Buddha. It's very subtle, it's very simple and very subtle. Oh, brethren, he's always talking to crowds of monks. Imagine you're the monks, okay? And you've done this enlightened man before you who just appears so wonderful. Oh, brethren, actions do exist, and also their consequences, but the person that acts does not. So, when that body there goes outside and gets a cup of coffee and accidentally spills it on someone's foot and that hurts them, so those actions did exist and all the consequences did exist. But the actions didn't happen because somebody caused them to happen. They happened because of a physical body in a physical world. This is the doctrine of codependent arising within Buddhism, which is that everything that happens happens because of what went before. It's a very early statement of a causally closed universe. Amazing, really, at 2,500 years ago. But it's hard to really believe that, I think. It means giving up free will. Now, in the early Buddhist literature, in Pali, in the Pali Canon, in Sanskrit, there isn't a word that directly translates into free will. Nevertheless, it's quite clear, I think, from the doctrine of codependent arising, that there's no room for free will in Buddhism. So this is an absolute contrast from the religions that most of you are probably more familiar with. So now I'm coming to challenge you on really the central point here, having played a little bit, I hope, with your sense of self and consciousness. I want you to think again about free will and what it might mean. Now, are there any philosophers here? You may be a little irritated with me because I'm not going into any of the deep philosophical stuff about free will at all. It's a nightmare. There's the compatibilist, the non-compatibilist, and the anti-compatibilist, and the determinism versus free will, and then there's all these very, very subtle interpretations of free will which just do my head in. I think one of the biggest problems I have for any philosophers here is that a lot of philosophers, and this is where I part company with Dan Dennett completely, so adapt the idea of what they mean by free will that they say it exists when it's not what most people believe by free will. So I'm ignoring all of that, and I'm just sticking with an ordinary, everyday sense of what I think most people mean by free will. In other words, I decide to do something, and because I think of doing it, that's why it happens. Would you agree roughly with that? Yes. Okay, that's what I'm wanting to find out whether you believe in it. So it's about your own conscious thoughts controlling your actions. So hands up who thinks that your own conscious thoughts control your actions. Right, and hands up who thinks their own conscious thoughts don't control their actions. Far fewer. Pardon? Well, that's not what we mean by free will. At least I don't think so. I think normally most people would mean by free will that they are aware what they want to do. I mean, if you accidentally trip over something, if some unconscious thought causes you to, you don't think of that as being exerting your own free will. Of course, your unconscious thoughts are going to have all sorts of consequences, but free will, I think, is when we think, I'm going to do it. So, let's have a look at a little bit of the problems here. So, I already looked at the brain and asked where actions come from. I want this little hedgehog here to help me. So this little hedgehog here has free will, okay? Are you ready? He says he's ready, and he does believe in free will. And you sure? Yes, he says he's ready for this experiment. Are you ready for this experiment? Very good. Okay, you didn't quite catch it, did you? But very quickly, that man there went like this, and that lady there went like this, and that person there went like that. And I don't know, I couldn't see the rest of you, but a lot of you were, turned your heads. The man who nearly caught it, what's your name, please, sir?
Lou.
Lou, what do you think happened? How would you describe what happened? You couldn't. Okay. What about any of the rest of you who did anything in response to this flying hedgehog? What happened?
Caused the action and he reacted.
Pardon?
You caused the action and he reacted to your action.
Okay, yes.
Spontaneous.
Spontaneous, okay. I'm quite surprised by these reactions because most people would say, I saw the hedgehog flying towards me and I tried to catch it. Yeah? Yeah, that seems kind of normal, doesn't it? Let us suppose that that's how it seems. I saw the hedgehog coming towards me and so I lifted up my arm and caught it. That is not what happened, actually, and some of these other comments you made are much more to the point. I don't think I want to go to Kabul anymore. I told you about all these different parallel pathways in the visual system, but there are two major pathways. So information comes in, lovely being able to walk up to the picture. So the information comes in from the eyes, it goes into the thalamus right in the middle of the brain, then it gets sent on from the lateral geniculate nucleus into the visual cortex at the back here. And then some of it goes through the superior colliculus and controls eye movements. And that happens incredibly fast. A couple of synapses. And those of you who just moved your eyes to follow the hedgehog, that would have been a visual pathway that's not even shown on this map, going straight to the eyes because the movement was detected and your eyes moved. Then the information comes down here to B1, B2, B3, edge detection, shape detection, corners, all sorts of things are being processed there. And a lot of the information then goes up here, and as you know from the previous picture, the motor strip is up there where actions are controlled. And because of this movement, which is very significant to the visual system, this dorsal stream here goes fast and controls hand movements, head movements, and all of that. For the lady who went like this to get out of the way, or the man who lifted his arm, that's going to be done by the dorsal stream. Much more slowly and carefully, another lot of the information, having the preliminary analysis having been done of the edges and corners and stuff, this information is sent off down here in the ventral stream to the temporal lobe, and that is where object recognition happens. And this is slow because what has to happen is building up a lot of information about the input, temporal and spatial information, and then comparing it with things you know about. So it's going to take a long time to know that it's a hedgehog coming towards you. And that's going to happen a lot later. You already, I submit, Lou, have caught the thing before there's anything in your brain going, it's a hedgehog coming towards me. But after the fact, you piece together what happened and you say, I saw the hedgehog coming and I caught it. That's a convenient fiction for the brain to tell. But it's important if we're really thinking about free will, or thinking about actions in general, to see that they're all kind of split up into different parts of the visual system. Now, I'm going to tell you about two more important experiments. First of all, before I tell you about this experiment, I want you all please to do something. I want you all to hold out your arm in front of you like this. Don't tickle the person in front. And then, whenever you feel like it, of your own free will, I want you to just flip your wrist like this. It's up to you when you do it, and I'm going to let you do it quite a lot of times, and I want you to sort of relax and just try and introspect on what's happening. Okay. Now, it probably feels as though you are thinking, I wonder when I'll move. Okay, I'll do it now. and then you do it, okay? Something like that. And then you're all laughing because the more you look into it, the more kind of you're not really sure what's going on. But anyway, the reason I got you to do that is because this is the action used in the most famous experiment ever done in the psychology of consciousness. It was done in the mid-80s, but people are still arguing about it. This is Libet's famous experiment on spontaneous deliberate action. There are thousands of academic papers written about this one experiment, honestly thousands, and there are several books entirely devoted to it, quite apart from the fact that it's mentioned in almost every book on consciousness that's ever been written. Well, that's a slight exaggeration, but the modern books on consciousness. It's that famous. Right, so what did Libet do? I want you to think about this action that you did here, and think of it in terms of three things. There's the brain activity going on that controls the action. There's your desire to move, or your will, that you're going to do it now rather than some other time. And there's the action itself. Which do you think came first of those three things? Anybody? The intention, somebody said. Yes? Anybody else? The brain. Activity in the brain. Anybody else? Pardon? The action. The action can't come first because that would be magic. I mean, there's got to be some brain processes that cause the action. So it's going to either be the brain processes or the thought or the intention or something of that kind. So how many people think that it's something conscious, that the thought of moving, that starts the thing off? Hands up. Right. How many people think that the brain action starts first? Right. Slightly more for the thought, but not much in it. Hands up who didn't put their hands up. Right. You put hands up who thinks they start at the same time. Okay, so that's the reason for not putting a hand up to one of the others. So what he did was a very clever experiment. And this is one of the reasons why it carries on being talked about even today. Primitive equipment that there was at the time. He got people in the laboratory to do exactly what you did and to hold out their arm like this and do exactly what you did. He had EEG electrodes on the motor cortex up here, which would detect something called the readiness potential. It was already known long before this that the readiness potential precedes any skilled motor action. And with averaging over many trials of the EEG, you can detect the beginning of the readiness potential. Those of you who've heard about this experiment, sometimes it's misdescribed as though the readiness potential is a kind of blip. It's not. It's the beginning of a ramp function that goes, it can take up to a second, it goes up and up and up and up and then just before the action happens. It's the brain's preparation for action that ends up with and off the action goes. So, he can measure the beginning of the readiness potential. He can easily measure the time of the action by putting electrodes on the wrist. And now he's got to measure the time when you decided to move. How could he measure the time when the conscious thought, I'm going to move now? How can he measure that? Any suggestions? And not from those who know the answer. How do you measure the time at which you have the will or the intention to move? Pardon?
You can't.
You might think you can't, because every time you think, well, you can measure something, it's either going to be in the brain, which of course then it's the brain, or it's the body. But he did it. He thought of a brilliant way. Yes? Oh, thank you. So what he did was, he had a spot revolving on a screen, and that's depicted there. So it's going clockwise. Is that clockwise for you? Yeah. Okay. And he asked the person to shout out where the spot was, like 12, 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, whatever, when they decided to move. And this is brilliant, because you're not measuring something that's going to be a lag. What you're actually asking for is the judgment of simultaneity. And he did lots of experiments to show that if you flash lights or touch people or whatever, they're very, very good at saying where the spot was when that happened. So, I want you to do this, please. I want to hold out your arm in front of you, and I want you to shout out where the spot was when you decided to move. Off you go.
3, 4, 7.
Come on, everybody join in.
5, 11,
Okay, very good, brilliant. There are a lot of people who say it can't be done, and there's all sorts of ridiculous arguments in the literature. You've just shown that it can be done. It's not clear actually what you're really doing. But you are willing to say, I know when I decided to act. So now we can ask the big question, which comes first? The decision to act, or the beginning of the readiness potential in the brain? And what Libet found was extremely clear. This is the moment of the action here, the electromyogram, the muscle electrodes. Forget that, it's a different experiment. Here, 200 milliseconds, a fifth of a second before the action, is the decision to move, and that gives you the feeling that I'm going to move back, just that fifth of a second. But way back here is the beginning of the action potential. In fact, in different experiments, it could be anywhere between a second and half a second before. And again, I'll come to you in a sec, again and again this has been replicated. It's been replicated in modern experiments with fMRI, PET scans, all kinds of different things. It doesn't have to use the more primitive stuff he was using. Yes?
Did he try to analyze how long the visual processing takes in order to read out the time? Did he account for that?
Yes, he did. That's why it was so important to do these other experiments with flashing lights and so on, because there's a very, very short lag. It's about 10 milliseconds or something like that that you might want to adjust. But it's very small indeed. There have been lots and lots of control experiments of this kind. And those are the sorts of questions that one needs to ask about it, and I'm not going to go into them now. I'm not also going to go into all the difficult philosophical questions about what it really means. The most obvious conclusion to jump to is that therefore free will doesn't exist. But that's not really justified in many ways, and I'm not going to go through all of that. But I think it does challenge our normal ideas about where our thoughts come from and what starts the actions off. And I'll leave it at that. If you're interested in the experiment, go and read some of the critical literature, because there's plenty. Even Wikipedia is really good on it. And that will give you some, if you want to find out more. But recent experiments have not only confirmed that finding in many different ways, but there have been much more extreme experiments. This is the most extreme. I will, satisfy myself just showing this most extreme one. And the researchers here made their subjects either move their left hand or their right hand. So their choice was between left and right, which is a slightly more interesting choice than when to flip your wrist. And they looked at what was going on in many parts of the brain that are concerned with actions. And this is fMRI, so they've got a very good picture of what's going on there. And the conclusion that they came to was that by looking at the EEG, if they didn't know, they could look at the EEG and they didn't know whether the person had moved their left or their right hand, they could tell from what was happening in the brain what decision was going to be made. And they concluded that the outcome of a decision can be encoded in brain activity of prefrontal and parietal cortex up to 10 seconds before it enters awareness. Now, I would say they are Cartesian materialists. They believe in the Cartesian theatre because they're talking about it entering consciousness, entering awareness. That's magic. So it's just another example of how neuroscientists again and again fall into Cartesian materialism. But never mind, the experiment is fantastic. They were able to predict on the basis of brain activity up to 10 seconds before whether the person was going to choose left or right. Now, these are all very, very artificial decisions. It's not possible, I don't know if it's even in principle possible, but to put someone in a scanner and say, right, you're going to decide whether you're going to marry that man or not, or whether you're going to take that job or not, or some big meaningful decision. It would be very, very difficult to get any clear conclusions. We can see where the decision processes are going on in the brain, but the timing of that, it's too difficult. So for the moment, these have to stand as a threat to the thought that we control our actions with free will in the way that it seems. One of the scientists, so I'm sad to say that he's died now, Dan Wegner, he wrote a wonderful book called The Illusion of Conscious Will. And he did some wonderful experiments. He used the most famous ones. He used something like a Ouija board. The Ouija board where you You have a little planchette or even an upturned glass, and 3 or 4 people put their hands on it, and it moves around and spells out words from the spirits. I've done a lot of Ouija boards in my days in parapsychology. I've talked to the spirits. And what he did was he had a confederate and a subject, and by manipulating where the thing stopped and having instructions in their ears about the object, they had little pictures and everything, he could manipulate the timing of the stop. They had to stop the glass on one picture or another. He could actually manipulate whether the people felt they had stopped it or the other person had stopped it. And he could manipulate it in both directions. In one direction so that the person, the unwitting subject who didn't realise the other person was a stooge, did actually stop it and thought the other person did it, or the other person did it and they thought they did it. This shows very clearly, and loads of other experiments, it's a fantastic book if you'd like to read it. This shows that the feeling that I did it is not the same as the fact that you did do it. In other words, that feeling cannot tell you one way or the other whether you did it. Whether you actually carried out the action or not, whether it came from an intention inside this body and brain, is an after-the-fact decision, additional to it. He says, in the conclusion of this book, his kind of model of what is going on is that all kinds of brain processes are involved in giving rise to 2 things. 1, the thought, I did it, or I'm going to do it, and 2, the action. And you know, if any of you are scientists, you'll be very familiar with the problem that we human beings tend to confuse correlation and cause. You know, we hear that, you know, people who eat lots of tomato ketchup do worse at school, or something like that. And you jump to the conclusion that tomato ketchup is really poisonous and makes you, ruins your brain. When actually, it's because poor people eat more tomato ketchup, or people who eat more chips and, the chips are bad for them, or, there's some other cause. Well, he says exactly that kind of mistake is happening all the time and giving rise to our sense of free will. Because, yes, I have the thought, I think I'd really like a cup of coffee after this. And then I go out there and lo and behold, there is some coffee and I have some. And it's a correlation. There is a correlation. There are things going on in here that lead to both things. But it's not that my thought caused my action. And so his wonderful conclusion is, our sense of being a conscious agent who does things comes at the cost of being technically wrong all the time. So if you suspect, I'm afraid I would like to go on for about another 5 minutes. Is that all right, or would you rather I just stopped here? Go on? Okay. Because I'm really getting to the sort of nitty-gritty of what I care about, but I had to kind of build up. I wanted to get you worried, and I hope you are worried, before I think about this. If you suspect that free will is an illusion, how many suspect it's an illusion, even if you're not really sure? Good, yeah. Okay, so if you suspect it, what do you do about it? I mean, how do you live your life? Pardon? Live with it. Yeah, but most people don't. An awful lot ignore the feeling and hope it will go away. Which is why I've been pushing at you. Really think about it till it hurts. You can go out of here and ignore the feeling and hope it will go away if you like, but I will have done my job if I've made it hurt and that you're worried about it. Maybe tomorrow you can ignore the feeling and hope it will go away. Or you do what an awful lot of people do. You act as if you have free will. And again and again and again, I hear people say, well, I can't just live my life without free will. I know it doesn't really exist, but I have to act as if. Or you stop believing in it. Like this man said here, you get on with it, you live with it. And this is very rare, I submit. I did a book called Conversations on Consciousness. I think I've got a couple of copies out there if you want to look at it or even buy it. But I interviewed a lot of neuroscientists and philosophers, 20 of them, really good neuroscientists and philosophers. And amongst the questions I asked all of them, do you have free will? And the answers were absolutely fascinating. Kevin O'Regan, I think, had the most extreme mechanistic sort of view of human beings. He said that from the age of 4, he knew that he was a robot. He started learning about neurons and synapses and things when he was about 5, and he, has always been fascinated in being a robot and enjoyed it. But even he said, when I said, "Do you believe you have free will?" he said, "Yes, everybody does. Even robots believe they have free will, even if they don't." Well, John Searle is a very famous philosopher, as I'm sure many of you will know. And he's absolutely dogmatic about it. I mean, he was at the conference here in Tucson the other day, and he said, "Well, I don't have a choice about that." We all think we have free will, and there's no way we can think away our own free will. Oh, yes, there is, John. Anyway, that's what he thinks. When I go to the restaurant, there are always restaurants come up in this thing. When I go to the restaurant and I look at the menu, I might decide, well, I'll have the spaghetti, but I'm not forced to have the spaghetti. I could have done something else. And that's how he interprets free will. And there's a whole massive philosophical discussions about could you have done something else? But he's kind of slithering away, I think, here. He's saying, I have to think, when I go in the restaurant, I have to believe I have free will. I have to act that way, and in fact, it's true as far as he's concerned. I asked Susan Greenfield, a well-known neuroscientist, do you have free will? I believe very much in my own free will. And here comes the restaurant again. I can see that you might be in your Sue Blackmore way, sitting there and saying, I wonder what she's going to order. But I don't think that every minute of your life you think, I wonder what she's going to do. Well, you might if you have schizophrenia. Well, Susan, I do spend my entire life wondering what this Susan is going to do. That's how it is for me, because I've long, long, long ago given up having any sense of free will. She thinks, therefore, I must be schizophrenic or mad or something. I don't know. Maybe I am. And Dan Wegner, whom I spoke about earlier on, says, I do the as if. And I think almost everybody who's happy and healthy tends to do that. I'm not happy or healthy. It's all because I don't believe in free will. Yeah. But I did have little glimmers of people who felt perhaps a little bit more like me. This is V.S. Ramachandran. You may know his work on amputations and all the fascinating stuff on brain science. He said, I really have to push into this. He said, I think it's a bit like the whole dance of Shiva thing. He's at Hindu. You think you're an aloof spectator watching the universe, but actually you're just part of the cosmic ebb and flow of the world. It's ennobling rather than diminishing. And this is the way I like to think about it. Having given up the sense of free will, as well as believing in free will, having come to terms with bundle theory and there not being really some self in here, I do feel that it's ennobling rather than diminishing. That it is a better way to live. It seems somehow to me to give rise to more capacity to relate to other people or be compassionate about other people. If I feel that they're the same, they're just doing what they do because of what has to happen. That's the way the universe is. I can be far more sympathetic to the vagaries of other people's actions, and that helps me to be more forgiving to myself as well when I do stupid things and I hurt people and I don't mean to, and that's how it is. As you said, get used to it. Was that what you said? Get on with it. But I do think it's helpful. Not just possible, but helpful. I often feel that I'm alone in doing this, but actually, since I made this slide a while ago, there are plenty of people out there who do this. There are lots of Buddhists who follow that particular path. I'm not a Buddhist, but I sympathise with that very greatly. There are other people who do it too. And I think it's a very positive kind of way to live. It's difficult. It makes your head hurt. There are occasions that come and you think, oh, but surely. But with practice, I think it's very helpful. Now, one of the reasons people give for not doing it is they say, but if I didn't act as though with free will, the whole society would fall apart, and the whole legal system would fall apart. No, it wouldn't. Our legal system at the moment, this is a long, complicated thing, and I'll just keep it very brief, but our legal system at the moment is based on being punitive. People are, like in the religions, really good or really evil, and we should punish them if they're bad. We could get rid of that entirely, but we would still need to punish and reward people. Because if you punish people for doing bad things, that may deter them from doing it again, and it may deter other people from doing it. We would still have to lock up dangerous psychopaths who are likely to go out on the street and murder people, But we would stop having this distinction between, did people really do this of their own free will? Were they morally responsible in that sense? Instead of asking that question, with all the, what's that defence you have in America? Pardon?
Expert testimony.
Not the expert testimony, that somebody ate a sugar bun or something. Do you know what I mean? A muffin. Yeah, thank you, the Twinkie. And instead of having that defence, because it was the sugar that made me do it, or it's the memes that made me do it, or it's my genes that made me do it, you wouldn't ask any of those questions, and all those ridiculous arguments would go away. Instead, you would ask, would it do any good to punish this person? Either to that person or to other people and to society in general. So it wouldn't all fall apart, it wouldn't all be disastrous. We could all actually cope with our neuroscience telling us that we do not have free will. So I just want to ask you one last question. Will you be going to lunch of your own free will? Thank you. I think there's a microphone here going around. If anybody would like to ask a question. Oh, it's not going around. You've got to queue up for it. Right, fine. That makes it easy. Yeah, that's perfect. It's much easier.
Dr. Blackmore,
Oh, could you turn off the projector, somebody, please, and then I can stand over here without getting my eyes done.
we can go back to the transporter experiment.
Yeah.
Okay. And just adjust it a little bit. And presumably the technology that made that would also allow us to make a replication. So if instead of being transported, you were duplicated.
Yeah.
Where would the free will go? And where would the self and the ego and that stuff go?
Thank you very much.
There's a very thought-provoking science fiction story called Rogue Moon, where this is actually applied. It started me thinking about it about 30 years ago.
I won't ask all of you what you think. It's a classic question when people start thinking about the teletransporter. My own view would be this. Let's say we took, it's gone away, but we had 3 chairs and we made 2 versions of the copy, or even 20 versions, it doesn't matter. I think every one of those would wake up and go, as we do hundreds of times a day, oh, here I am. Every one of those would go, oh, here I am. Oh, I'm Sue. I can remember I went to Tucson. And it would be just like I am. But very quickly they'd start diverging, because one of them would be here and one would be there, and different things would happen, and so they would become different people. Only very slightly different, but nevertheless different. That's what I think would happen. Because there isn't a soul, there isn't a spirit, there isn't a ephemeral thought, there isn't anything other than that process, in my opinion. And so I disagree with various people here who hold a different opinion. Yes?
That was a terrific summary, and we all take positions on this. I've been a neuroscientist for 50 years and actually done a little bit of work on this empirically. Libet's work has a lot of problems, as you know.
He calls himself Libet.
Libet. Delays in the nervous system and stuff like that, but I won't go into that. I think we can have it both ways. We don't have to make a position. When you said ego and bundle, I did not put my hand up, because the bundle theorists are on the top of the brain, and the ego theorists are on the bottom of the brain, even though they don't know it. Now, we know for a fact that the coherence of the organism is subcortically organized, whereas our cognitive processes are cortically organized. When we make decisions, and obviously we do make decisions, it's a deliberative process. There are many things percolating in the subcortical domain, moods, emotions, things that direct our values, direct our choices, and they're very slow processes, actually. We've timed them to some extent, and then the top of the brain has to deal with this. The top of the brain is intrinsically unconscious. We know that. In other words, the ascending reticular activating system allows the top of the brain to be conscious. And the dilemma is between the top and the bottom, and we have to respect both. Neuroscience has only respected the top largely, because in the humans we don't have access to the bottom.
I agree with you in many respects, and your description of what the bits of the brain are doing, yes, but I don't think any of that allows us to have it both ways. it actually emphasizes what I was trying to say about the kind of thing that the brain is. It's a multiple parallel system with amazing numbers of things going on at different speeds. So the slower processes are going along at the same time with the moods and the changes that depend on slow-moving chemicals and so on, along with the fast processes.
The I is linked to those bottom processes, the coherence of the organism.
If you think the I is linked to anything, then I respect your right to hold such a view, but that's magic. The I is...
No, that's
the
science.
I is...
That's science.
No. No. The science tells us what
We
brains
can
do.
have it both ways.
Well,
that's the important point.
then there are neuroscientists in the world who think you can have it both ways, and I'm not one of them. Thank you very much. It's very helpful to have these different views
That's a hard one to follow. Anyway, that's a hard one to follow, is the question. You didn't mention much about stored information or memory affecting the decisions you were making at that instant. And when you mentioned the transportation, I made an assumption I probably shouldn't have, but I thought that if you transported that person, that the reason I didn't want to lose myself as a person is my stored memory, the information that I have in me being lost. And that may have been a bad assumption. You also mentioned
Can I answer that one first? Or
yeah.
Then you can let go on from there. The assumption that I'm making that could be false is everything we know about stored memories is that they are stored by a process of synapse formation. So when you do something, or see something, or hear something, what's happening is little dendrites are growing out from the synapses, and actually we saw wonderful films of this happening at the conference this week. And they're sort of growing around them, but according to what's happening in the visual system or wherever it is, they do or don't make a connection and a new synapse. And the length of the dendrites and where they're making the synapse in terms of the distance from the cell body and the postsynaptic memory all makes a difference to the memories. So in this teletransporter experiment, all of the dendrites and the boutons and the synapses would all be exactly replicated, and therefore, if you think that's all there is to memory and that's how it works, all the memories will be there. And that's why you would wake up and go, oh, here I am again, this is me. Oh, I'm in Kabul now.
Okay. And on the stored memory, the other, you mentioned that right at the end on free will, that if somebody murdered somebody or something, we should still punish them. Isn't that to give them a stored information or memory so that they wouldn't want to do that?
Yes, it is precisely. The whole way we behave as humans and the illusions and delusions we have about ourselves depend on memory. I mean, without our memory, we know this from damage to the brain where people lose the capacity to lay down memories, or they lose their different ways they can have their memory destroyed or harmed. It's critical that you can remember. So in this new world that I'm imagining, the murderer murders somebody. They go into the court, and the question we ask is, should this person be punished? We would still have things like the difference between manslaughter, and you have different degrees of murder here, don't you? We don't, but anyway, those things, you probably still have those. But the fundamental question you would ask is, would it help anything to lock this person up? And if you think that they are capable of going out there and deciding again, because of how they were brought up, probably their terrible childhood or whatever it might, doesn't matter what is in their memory, that they might do it again, and that you'll deter them by punishing them, then you'll punish them. Or if you think it's psychopathic and their memory and everything else is so distorted and they have a total lack of capacity to understand anyone else's pain, then you lock them up because they simply are going to do it again because they couldn't possibly help it. So memory is critical to all of this, absolutely.
This is one of my favorite subjects in my life. I was a Tibetan Buddhist for 23 years and was one of the first Tibetan Buddhists to come out of Tibetan Buddhism. I was always an atheist, and so I just tried Tibetan Buddhism to see how it was. Anyway, I completely disagree with you on your definitions of Buddhism. Of course, Buddhism itself is a very vague concept.
There's loads and loads and loads of parts of it.
Yeah, as far as our tradition went, there was a very strongly grounded belief in self.
Yeah.
The ground of all being, and Buddha mind was all about self.
Yeah.
So anyway, what happens when the fascists get hold of this you posit the idea that we can be very open and dignified and have all these wonderful relationships. But to me, your conversation has really been more about selflessness and nihilism than it has been about free will, which I consider free will as sort of like a red herring. To me, free will doesn't exist, but it seems to me that sort of discounting free will also can get you into a lot of trouble. I mean, the communists take Diego Rivera, or Frida Kahlo, and they thought that the machines were going to bring us a really good life. But if you look at it from not a neuroscience point of view, but you look at it from a human rights point of view, where are human rights going to be in a state where there is no self, where we do not recognize the self?
Okay, I absolutely agree with you about some of the things you said about Tibetan Buddhism, but I think I said that earlier on myself, because within the Tibetan tradition, you have this notion of personal reincarnation, and ideas about there is a self who's going to be reincarnated and might come back as a bodhisattva or might come back as a frog, whatever else it might be. And that is not present in all of Buddhist tradition, and as I gave you some quotes there from the Buddha, from the early Pali Canon, clearly what he was doing in response to the pre-Hinduist folk traditions of his time was saying, no, there is no Atman and all these concepts of self. The self isn't like that, it's just like a carriage. And that has stayed there much more in the Theravadan tradition and in Zen and Chan and other traditions than it has in the Tibetan tradition. But it's fascinating that if you look in the West, the Tibetan tradition is so much more popular. This is meme evolution as far as I'm concerned. People want there to be a self. They like the idea of, you get a good next life or a bad one according to what you've done. And so just like Christianity, it takes its place. Now, what would happen in a world with no self? It's not that there aren't people. It's not that there isn't moral responsibility. It's not that there isn't suffering, anguish, love, compassion, or anything else. It's that those things spring from human beings in a social world, not from little thinking, magical, separate selves. It wouldn't be so terrible, I do not think.
Human rights and government, how does
human rights is something that we give to people. In an advanced society, we invent the concept of human rights and we give it to people. And we try to say that men and women should be equal before the law. We try to say that we shouldn't discriminate unfairly on the grounds of race, sex, and age, and all the other things that we think are irrelevant. And that those kinds of human rights and caring for people, I think, would actually be enhanced rather than destroyed by having a much truer view of the nature of a human being.
First, just as a little aside, in the transporter experiment, I think if the choice of transporter location that the woman actually gave was Cabo as opposed to Cabo, I think that would have been much more in time to go.
Cabo San Lucas, not Cabo. A beach in Mexico.
Well, if only you told me at the time, because I would have gone if I'd known I was going to a beach in Mexico. I've never heard of that beach in Mexico. However, I went to Kabul instead, and it was harder than I had known.
So I mean, this collection of elements is pretty much okay with that idea of illusion of free will, illusion of self, even the illusory nature of what we call mind. But what you only really touched on a little bit, and I'd like to hear you talk more about, is the possible illusory nature of consciousness itself. Can you speak to that?
Sorry, I missed the last bit.
The possible illusory nature of consciousness itself.
Ooh. Where do I
We need
begin?
to go to lunch within an hour.
Thank you, Adam. That is my dear husband, who has come out from England yesterday. He's rented an RV, which he was very brave in driving, and we're going off for a week into the desert once I've done all my work. We were not going to be going to Cabo or Car, whatever you said it was, but I think the Arizona desert will be just wonderful. Why he said that was because he has had the pleasure, distress of sitting through hours and hours of lectures that I gave on exactly that question, why consciousness is an illusion. And again, I've told you what I mean by an illusion. Something is not what it seems to be. And I think that very many people think of consciousness as some kind of power, some kind of continuous stream of experiences that is had by an experiencer. So that's one part of the illusion that I've already talked about. And you should be able to kind of fill in the dots. So they think of it as being something that requires an experiencer, no experiences without an experiencer, and there's a kind of a stream of experiences going along. And they think of it as something that has power. So people say, well, what does consciousness do, or why did it evolve? It helps us make decisions. It helps us sort out different issues. It helps us to, I don't know, be nice to other people. Any number of things that people say, or it helps us get out of danger. In my view, all of that is illusory because actually there's just the machine doing this stuff and coming up with a story about self who has consciousness. So in a way, I don't need to give the hours and hours of lectures because I've already explained to you why the two fundamental aspects of consciousness that people attribute to it are false. So what are we left with? We're left with this experience. How on earth can this physical brain be related to this? Look at this red. See this red? Are you having an experience of the red? That's what the philosophers call a qualia, the plural. The experience, what it's like to be you seeing the red. That's the big problem in consciousness studies called the hard problem. How can subjective experiences arise from objective processes in the brain? As soon as you say arise from, you're already a dualist and you've got huge problems. And all this week in Tucson, we've been struggling like anything with all of this, and I'll leave it at that because I do not have an answer to, I don't have a great theory of consciousness. All I think is we're deluded about it, and the first step we need to do is to get through the delusions, and then maybe we'll get an answer to that really, really difficult question. Thank you for the question.
I appreciate your thoughts that society would fall apart if we got rid of the idea. And I also am a theorist. What I'm trying to define in my own mind is the concept of responsibility. And since I'm a bundle, how do we construct it? That's my only thing I can come up with.
Yeah.
And does that become part of us, or is it our DNA, or is it an environmental construct?
I think the latter. I mean, this is really difficult stuff, so I'm not, some of these things I'll say to you, this is my answer. Here I'm really cautious, but responsibility is something we attribute to people and attribute to ourselves. It's not some inherent quality of a being that has free will. It's something that we need in order to operate as a society to say, that person was responsible or not. When I gave the example of the man spilling the coffee, notice he wasn't really responsible. It was an accident. And in other things we'd say it's something we attribute, given our knowledge of how humans behave.
When you automatically say you did it of your own free will, it's some sort of like automatic.
Yeah, and that leads us to all these false ideas. But if we said you did it deliberately or something like that, if you change the word, then we don't think of all these other things. We are able to understand human action in that way without the illusions. I think that no more people ought to join the queue because it's 12 o'clock, but I'm very happy to do the three who are in the line. Sorry, line, not queue. I expect you understand proper English, don't you?
Well, I'd like to clarify, maybe you covered it, but I need to clarify it for my mind. This machine, it's not me, it's the machine. On what is it basing on what's happening that this is the action that's going to take place? Is it based on memories that are stored in the synapses? What is it doing that it picks this and not that? Because it is picking something.
There may be some random things involved, but fundamentally, means, genes, and environment. This amazingly complex human being here has lived for some decades, has got phenomenally complex and wonderful memories based upon being in a physical environment, absorbing means, you know, the language that you speak, which is English, maybe you speak other languages, I don't know, the stories that you're able to tell, the words you know, the concepts you have, what happened yesterday, what's happened just now, where you are physically in the environment, those are the determinants of the decision to do this rather than that, whatever it is. That's the world we have to live in, and it's so complex that we cannot say for any of these actions, decisions that we make, all the determinants. But at least we can know the sorts of things that they are. So we are a choice machine. You, this amazing thing here, is a choice machine, making amazingly difficult, some easy ones, but some difficult choices. Because it's that kind of multiple parallel processing machine.
Can I just add one thing? Watson was the computer that won on Jeopardy. So Watson was programmed to know. Do you know the program Jeopardy? Okay, it's a very sophisticated question and it has to be answered in a certain way. And people are very smart to do that. It's like this. Watson won because Watson was programmed in such a way to know not only the answer, to pick it from everything that has been programmed into it, but to know how to answer the question. And that's how I think we are programmed, from what you've said and from seeing that. So we can think of ourselves not as a self, but as a computer.
Yeah, fine. And I'm glad if you're happy to do that.
And Watson was massively parallel.
Oh, thank you, yes. If he's massively parallel, that helps, because a serial machine is going to not be able to make decisions at all quickly.
Hi. You were saying how you and Dennett both believe there is no Cartesian theater in the mind, that's just an illusion. But in a way there really is. There is a specific optic nerve that comes in from your eyes and goes into the rest of the brain. There's auditory nerves coming in from the ears. And really all that defines reality as we know it is just 5 chords coming in from your various senses. For all you know, you could be a brain in a vat with these optic nerves and auditory nerves just hooked up to a computer that's running a very realistic simulation. And you know, I just was wondering how that would relate to it. There is kind of, you know, a self, and some people say, well, maybe this whole thing is just a simulation, and you know, it's a very realistic video game where we chose to selectively erase our previous memories. Maybe we have lived other lifetimes and, you know, insert ourselves into this video game called Life in the 21st Century. And, you know, there is a self outside of us where we will, you know, return to when we die, possibly. You know, you wake up when it's over and say, oh, yeah, that was a fun video game. I remember all my other lifetimes. I'm going to go play as a different character this time.
Yeah. I love playing with these ideas. We had a most wonderful session yesterday on mind uploading. And there were these scientists there who really think they're getting close to preserving an entire brain and then uploading it later. They're not ready with the stuff to upload it into yet, but they get your brain preserved in a few decades they will. So it's all great fun. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not going to speculate about whether this could be something of that kind at all. But when you said there is a Cartesian theatre, no. I mean, the more we learn about how the senses work, the less they seem to be how they feel. So, for example, vision, the natural way to think about it is that as you look around, make saccades, that you're sort of building up a picture of this room in your head. But we have experiments like change blindness, inattentional blindness, all kinds of psychology experiments. Does anyone know the famous video about Did You See the Gorilla? Yeah. Okay. Excellent, good. So you know it is possible for you to look right at something and not see it. Something is amazing as someone in a gorilla suit going. There are other experiments I can show you the opposite, where you haven't looked at something and yet you've seen it because of the inferences the brain is making because of these massive parallel systems. There's nowhere in the visual system that corresponds to what you think you're seeing. You think you're seeing the whole picture, and nowhere in the brain is that. That's one of the aspects in which Dennett means that there's no Cartesian theatre, and I agree with him. Thank you. And you have a last question.
Yeah, I had a couple of observations. One is that I must express an objection to mechanistic analogies and metaphors regarding the operation of the mind. One of my reasons is that while we say that a machine operates automatically, we can only say so because we posited the existence of the machine. And so if we say the machine operates automatically to present a simulation of will, then we have a problem because the machine, to generate a simulation of will, had to arise somewhere. And since you posited the existence of a machine that generates the illusion of will, then you've just ended up with a tautology. You just said, well, it comes into existence. I'll just leave you with that one real quickly, but I don't want to get bogged down in it, because I just wanted to touch on it. I thought on a Buddhist analogy, because I'm this gal's husband, so I've been on the Buddhist thing for a while. My own personal experience with Buddhism started in Bodhi when I was walking around in this Thai temple. And I perceived this image up in the sky, because I was looking up in the sky. Right? And there was two groups of drummers marching around, so maybe they were synchronizing my hemispheres. But in any event, I looked up in the sky, and I noticed that there was like a spinning group of plates that had been pushed together by the very impulse of the spin. Right? And I looked up in the sky and I said, these plates were all stuck together by the impulse of the spin. What happens if you remove the impulse of the spin? I removed the impulse of the spin, the plates separated up, and I found myself looking at the empty sky. And I thought, gee, if I just stop the impulse, what could that impulse be? The Buddha said it was desire. So it's the plates, it's the impulse of desire that keeps the integrated notion of self in operation and gives it the impetus to continue on. So I was 19 at that point, so I've been stuck with that concept now for quite a long time. But it seems to me that the resolution of the issue, the conundrum, that you present using Buddhist thought to present it, in order to alleviate people's anxiety, they could just go and see the Buddhist answers.
Could just go what?
Pardon me?
What was the last bit?
They could alleviate their confusion by just going and reading the Buddhist answers.
Yes. Fine. Well, shall I leave it at that?
Thank you very much. Now, we'll be 25 minutes.